Good. Any other comments? Any other thoughts?
It does tend to, that all of the ones, the three that don't produce, it tends to point towards priorities.
Yes. Yes, very much so. The Gospel of Matthew very much points to priorities. And when we don't have our priority, when Christ is not our top priority, our allegiance to heaven, to the kingdom of God, first and foremost, then we start having confusion and contradiction in our lives, and we start seeing a lack of spiritual growth and productivity. Yes, ma'am.
I think for people who don't have an agricultural background,
Yes.
these people do not understand how much you have to work the soil and what it takes to have productive soil.
Okay, that's an excellent point. For
It's
us,
a lot of work.
it's a lot of work, and I think if you were, most of who Jesus is speaking to, they understand this image and they say, okay, I know that soil takes a lot of work, and the idea is you need to put that much work into your spiritual life as well to nurture your ability to be conducive to growth and productivity. It does take a lot of work. This isn't just, okay, I cleared out the weeds and I'm good to go. I put my scarecrow up there and the birds aren't coming. It's an ongoing, constant thing. You can't just take care of it for the season and then you're off. We need to constantly be nurturing our spiritual life. And yeah, I think their understanding of soil would have spoken to that better than what most of us tend to understand. So yeah, that's a good point. Let's move on to the wheat and the tares. And he's going to throw another agricultural image at us. So keep some of these things that we've already talked about soil and growth and all these things in mind. Again, these are images very, very familiar to these people. He's going to change it a little bit. He's going to change some of the imagery. Some of it is going to stay the same. What we do need to be careful of is not reading whatever an element was from the last one is now an element in this one. In the last one, we are more representative of the soils, whereas in this next, the parable of the wheat and the tares, we're really more representative of seeds. So we need to kind of keep that image, those images separated, but also understand some progression of thought through some of these parables. Let me just throw out a couple of just rhetorical questions. Questions that I'm sure at some point, if you've been at church for any length of time, you've probably wondered. Why does God allow evil in the church? Why are there so many unproductive and spiritually ambiguous people in church? They come and they're nice and they're wonderful, but there's not a lot more than that. Why are there so many churches but so little impact? Why are there so many ungodly Christians who do wicked things? Why do I do wicked things? Why doesn't God just get rid of all the bad people and take them out of the church and the world now? Or why doesn't God take the good people out of the world now and just leave the rest of it for whatever happens? Okay, the problem is, we look around, we see all these churches, and we've been to a lot of churches, and we see a lot of bad and we see a lot of ambiguity. A lot of spiritual ambiguity. There's all kinds of reasons for that. And there's many passages in Scripture that speak to the why, what creates spiritual ambiguity. But Jesus wants to explain why that ambiguity continues now. We're right to look at that. We're right to look at, well, why are there evil people in church? Why are there spiritually ambiguous people in church? We're right to look at that and feel like that's not the way it should be. Jesus is going to use this parable and say, yeah, that's not the way it should be, but that is the way it is now. There will be a point in the future where it's no longer like that. Now, that's nice to know, because, otherwise we'd be on a crusade to just, get rid of all these bad people now. But Jesus is going to say that's the way things are during this age. At the end of this age, there will be a winnowing that will clearly separate the wheat from the chaff, the good from the bad, that will minimize the spiritual ambiguity. So this is kind of how I'm summarizing this next parable, and this will make sense as we kind of hash through this. Evil and spiritual ambiguity in the kingdom now will be completely clarified in the next phase of the kingdom later. Evil and spiritual ambiguity in the kingdom now will be completely clarified in the next phase of the kingdom later. God is allowing evil to persist during this time. And as frustrating as it is, and as much as we look at it and say, wait a minute, that's not right. That's the way it is now. We just need to deal with that. And I think where he's going to come back to is say, listen, if that's the way it is, we as individual believers better make sure that we are as unambiguous spiritually as we can possibly be. We better make sure that we as individuals are striving to be as fervent, as faithful followers, as productive as we possibly can be in light of all the spiritual ambiguity and in light of what's going to happen to those who are spiritually ambiguous at the end of this age. So that's basically the idea. Just to review, and this is a little review I kind of want to put in here, just to remind us about the function of the parables. The parables are trying to teach, each one of them teaches a main point, and what we're going to see is when these are piled on top of each other, like in Matthew chapter 13, there's a little bit of there's a building block kind of a sense to them, where one builds on top of the other. And also, just to remind you, parables reveal truth to those who are on the inside, but they conceal truth to those on the outside who are not meant to understand. In fact, we'll deal with a word here in this parable that shows us how there were some that understood it, and at the end of Matthew 13, there are some who reject Jesus because they don't understand it. So it reveals truth to those who are inside. It intentionally conceals truth to those who are out on the outside. And that's what Jesus is saying when he says, he who has an ear, let him hear. Some are going to hear this, some are going to reject this. So now Jesus has already kind of provided in verse 23, and he's going to build off of this, the idea that we need to hear, we need to understand, and we need to bear fruit. So we're going to build off that idea that productivity is what's important as that launches us into this next parable. Let me read Matthew 13. I'll start in verse 24. And what we're going to end up doing is we're going to skip a little bit, and we're going to come back to the interpretation a few verses after this. So Matthew 13:24. Jesus presented another parable to them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemies came and sowed tares among the wheat, and went away. But when the wheat sprouted and bore grain, then the tares also became evident also. The slaves of the landowner came and said to him, 'Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares?' And he," meaning the master of the landowner, "said to them, 'An enemy has done this.' The slaves said to him, 'Do you want us to go and gather them up?' But he said, 'No, for while you are gathering up the tares, you may uproot the wheat with them.'" Verse 30, "Allow both to grow together until the harvest, and in the time of the harvest I will say to the reapers, first gather up the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them up, but gather the wheat into my barn." Now I'm going to skip down to verse 37. Actually verse 36. We'll come back to the mustard seed and the leaven and some of these other things, but let me skip down to the interpretation of the wheat and the tares parable in verse 36. "Then he left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples came to him and said, 'Explain to us the parable of the tares of the field.' And he said, 'The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and as for the good seed, these are the sons of the kingdom, and the tares are the sons of the evil one. And the enemy who sowed them is the devil, and the harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels." Verse 40, "So just as the tares are gathered up and burned with fire, so shall it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send forth his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all stumbling blocks and those who commit lawlessness, and will throw them into the furnace of fire. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear." So let's go back to verse 24 of Matthew 13. and start working through the telling of this parable, and then we'll jump over. We're not going to go element by element. You know, the first soil and the interpretation, the second soil and the interpretation. We're just going to look at the original parable, the way it was told, and try to see kind of where he's going with this. The parable helps us explain helps explain why evil isn't taken out of the world immediately. Why believers, on the other hand, why believers ourselves are not taken out of the world. Why we are allowed to grow in the world and live in a world where there is so much evil, and to a certain extent, why there is so much of evil and spiritual ambiguity even in the church. So there's a couple things in common with the previous parable. One thing is that you have a sower, you have seed, and there's also the repetition of the word of the word good. In verse 24, he says, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed." Again, we're not supposed to read a lot of meaning into this word good. It is just, I always think it's a way of saying, hey, the seed is not the problem. It's good seed. So before we want to say, oh, maybe the sower had a bad batch of seed, you want to say, no, the seed is fine. That's not the problem. And I think the idea of it being good is just that it is expected to produce. It is expected to grow. The sower, unlike the previous parable, you know, you're not talking about some getting thrown on the stones or or among the weeds. It's going where it should go. It's going in the field, like it says in verse 24. The man who sowed good seed in his field. Okay. So the problem is not the sower, the seed, the field. Everything is good so far. We have then in verse 25 we have these men. These are his. We find out later these are his servants, his slaves. We're not going to go into the big socio-political thing about servants and slaves. The reality is these are his people who are supposed to be working for him. In verse 25 it says, while his men were sleeping. So I found some difference of opinion on this particular detail. And like I've tried to say, we want to be careful with parables that we don't read too much meaning into them. But I don't want to skip over details either. I think there may be something significant while his men were sleeping. In Matthew especially, the idea of sleeping frequently indicates neglect or apathy of some kind. If you want to chase this down on your own, Matthew 8:24 actually is Jesus sleeping. Where is he sleeping?
On the ship.
He's sleeping in the middle of a storm.
Yeah.
And he doesn't care what's going on around him. That's how confident he is in who he is. Those who are not confident in who he is are his disciples who are freaking out. I think it's a really interesting story. We kind of miss the fact that these are very experienced fishermen, and they're on a boat, and there's a storm, and they're freaking out. Surely they've been in storms before. I don't know if you've ever, I think about this a lot. If you've ever flown and things are getting a little rocky and you're really a little worried about what's going on here, and the captain, in a nice calm voice gets on and says, well, we're experiencing a little bit of turbulence, and it's going to be bumpy for a while, but we're going to be fine. And think, okay, he's the expert, he knows that everything's fine. Imagine if he gets on and says, well, we're all going to die. And you think, it's over. If this experienced pilot is freaking out, these experienced fishermen are all up in arms about this, and Jesus is so confident in who he is. He's not even worried. He's asleep. Now, in that instance, the idea of sleep and it being apathetic or negligent, it doesn't mean in a negative way, it means in a confident way. Matthew 25:5. Oh, Matthew 25:5. Beginning of chapter 25 is this parable of the 10 young women, the 10 virgins. What is interesting about this is that 5 are prepared and 5 are not. Yet it is interesting what happens in verse 5. Now while the bridegroom was delaying, they all got drowsy and began to sleep.